Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Greetings, and welcome to the 2024 Royal Geographical Society Institute of British Geographers Antipode Lecture. My name is Yusuf Al-Balushi, and on behalf of the editorial collective of Antipode, it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker. Lala Khalili is Al-Qasimi Professor of Gulf Studies in the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. She was trained in engineering and politics, but as I'm sure you already know, she is also an extremely sophisticated geographer. One of the slogans of the past year of protest marches confronting the ongoing genocidal campaign against the Palestinian people by Israel has been, "We will honor all our martyrs, all the children's sons and daughters. We will honor all our martyrs, all the parents, mothers, and fathers." The ubiquity of martyrdom is central to the Palestinian liberation struggle, and this is a topic that Khalili explores in depth in her first book from 2007, Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration. Moving from refugee camps in Lebanon to the transnational spaces of movement discourse and imagination to occupied Palestine, Khalili examines Palestinian narratives of heroism, suffering, and sumud, or steadfastness. She argues that commemorative practices, ceremonies, rituals, memories, and history-telling all represent, reinterpret, and remember the national past in an ongoing and dynamic way, and in so doing set the stage for crafting future strategies. Moving dialectically from an account of resistance to forms of violent subjection, her second single-authored book shifted from the memorialization of national liberation struggles to the spaces of carceral confinement and counterinsurgencies. Published in 2013, Time in the Shadows, Confinement in Counterinsurgencies examines primarily U.S. and Israeli strategies of liberalizing warfare, shedding light on what the provision of security and protection used to justify counterinsurgency campaigns actually look like in practice. The book argues that liberal political ideologies did not succeed in reforming warfare to make it less violent, but instead birthed the horrors of indefinite confinement and torture, buttressed by the law and administrative bureaucracy, which we have witnessed in places like Abu Ghraib in Iraq, Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, and Atlit prison in Israel. As she puts it, racialization of the enemy is crucial to liberal counterinsurgencies, in that ultimately a racial hierarchy resolves the tensions between illiberal methods and liberal discourse, between bloody hands and honeyed tongues, between weapons of war and emancipatory hyperboles. Indeed, across her expanding body of work, Khalili remains extremely attentive to how the body, in its gendered and racialized dimensions, is woven into questions of colonial power, violence, and resistance. Each of her new projects also seems to evolve dialectically out of underexplored elements of a prior study, first shifting from national liberation movements to counterinsurgency, and more recently in a move from forms of spectacular and direct violence to the ways structural violence undergirds and reinforces direct violence. In her 2020 study, Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula, what appears as somewhat mundane on the surface, the world of maritime trade and shipping, is, she shows us, central to the very fabric of global capitalism. Khalili deploys her long-standing commitment to both ethnography and archival work to tell an amphibious story that de-exceptionalizes the Arabian Peninsula by illustrating how shipping relies on crucial forms of infrastructure, labor, racialization, colonial continuities of capital, and war. As she beautifully puts it, the strange conjunctures of capitalism and trade and migrant labor and geopolitics and oil and dirt and filth and violence that make the sector are no less fascinating because they are made so invisible. Most recently, in The Corporeal Life of Seafaring, published this year, Khalili expands this line of thinking to dig even deeper into the embodied dimensions of the labor that makes the world of shipping possible. The chapter titles of this study wonderfully illustrate the way she methodically breaks down each dimension of the embodied work of seafarers into flesh, muscles, belly, eyes, legs, soul, and the heart. As she illustrates with her words and her own photographs, the body of the seafarer is a fulcrum upon which global systems of power, long-standing maritime traditions, and gendered and racialized pressures all rest. Guided as Antipode has been since its origin by an abiding commitment to radical praxis, we can think of no better person to help us better comprehend and then intervene in our current conjuncture than Professor Lala Khalili. Her talk today is appropriately titled, "Where is Palestine?" Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
I'm a bit sad that the mood lighting is gone. It felt like being in a kind of a chill place. But thank you very much for being here. Before I do the requisite thanks, especially to Yusuf, I think you may have received this flyer as you were entering. Please do pay attention to it. It is about an event that is being put together by a bunch of your colleagues and comrades about the geographical responsibility and scholasticide in Palestine. This roundtable is going to take place tomorrow, Friday, both virtually and in person. In person, it is going to be at the Education Center in this building at 9 a.m. So please do go to it. Additionally, if you can't make it to that event, whether virtually or otherwise, I think it's really important for you to also use the QR code on the back to find the BDS pledge, which I'm only going to briefly touch on. The BDS pledge requires geographers to be committed to supporting the rebuilding of Palestinian education system, boycotting institutions, higher education institutions, which are complicit in Israeli settler colonialism, divesting, refusing to engage with any corporations involved in supporting Israeli occupation, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, or genocide in Palestine, defending academic freedom of our colleagues and our students in particular, and supporting other scholars and students whose right to protest, boycott, or freedom of speech is under attack, and finally, advocating for greater autonomy of research groups within the RGS, if you're a member, you should do this, to facilitate the support of boycott movements, Palestine solidarity, and the defense of academic freedom. So please do pay attention to this. It's really a lot more important than what I'm about to say. Okay, now I would like to begin by thanking the editorial board of Antipode for asking me, a complete and utter interloper, to give the Antipode lecture to you geographers. And I want to thank Yusuf for an amazing introduction, which I want to get from you. I didn't know that's pretty amazing. Somebody that has actually read my books. I would also like to recognize the extraordinary Palestinian geographers who have taught me and on whose scholarship I rely. I would like to especially name-check Omar Jabari Salamanca, who I'm very sad is not here, Helga Tawil Suri, Karim Rabi, Sandi Hilal, Nasser Abu Rahmeh, and Ghazi Walid al-Falah, and Hashim Abu Shama, who some of you guys have been in his events. From all of whom I have learned so much. There are many, many, many other Palestinian scholars, artists, and writers who have inspired me, but given that this is a talk to geographers, and I really would, as much as I would love to name-check all of them, I will be naming some of them in the lecture, but just for the sake of brevity, please allow me to stick to the geographers. So the title of this talk, "Where is Palestine?" is meant to gesture to two different ways this sentence can be intoned. One is about the erasure or absence or misrepresentation of Palestine as a place, a real concrete place with real humans in Anglophone public discourse. The second is about the place itself and the contending imaginations of the place between a Praetorian Israeli state and its imperial sponsors who colonize this place, and the Palestinians and their allies who seek to liberate it. I shall begin with the first and get it out of the way. Allow me to confess that when I was invited to give this talk by comrades from Antipode, I think I was asked, because of the work I've done on maritime infrastructures, which is a subject dear to geographers. But I couldn't resist a bit of rabble-rousing when I noticed that the lecture's title is the Antipode Royal Geographic Society with the Institute of British Geographers. So allow me to begin with that. Palestine Literature Festival, or PALFest, was founded by Egyptian novelist Ahdaf Swaif in 2008. The festival has from the start had two mandates. The first is showcasing Palestinian authors, and the second is to take writers from the rest of the world to Palestine to familiarize them with the system of settler colonial apartheid in operation there. In the second PALFest in 2009, the Israeli state shut down the events in Palestine, and the festival program could only take place at the French Cultural Institute and the British Council there. 2 years later, the festival was tear-gassed. Israel disallowed permits for PALFest to take place in Gaza multiple times, but it did once in 2012. The festival in Palestine was matched with festivals in Europe and the US to introduce Palestinian authors and writers on Palestine to a broader public. PALFest organizers had planned an event on 27 October 2023 to take place at the Royal Geographic Society in this building. In fact, probably in this hall. Among the invitees was the recent Nobel Prize winner Abdulrazak Gurna, whose amazing Indian Ocean novels I hope you've read. 2 weeks before the event, and with many hundreds of tickets sold, the Royal Geographic Society cancelled the long-planned event, citing infelicitous risk assessments, security advice about the safety of historic buildings and those in and around it, arising from unspecified but sinister disorder, quote unquote. I wonder how many people in this room have had to fill out risk assessment forms. I'm sorry. These forms are devised by committee, this one is from Exeter, and are made to seem administrative, mundane, anodyne. Will there be fire provisions? Is there a risk of disruption from outside? The forms themselves are endless, pages and pages of badly formatted, difficult to fill Word documents, often in an old version of Word, color-coded with line after line or cell after cell of ever more senior managerial signatures required for an event to be held. The intent is to provide an administrative means to silence and stymie conversations which the powers deem to be controversial. Do you know when systems of room booking, demands for neutral chairs, and risk assessment forms for events were introduced into academic work? I've been long enough in British Academy and particularly in London universities to remember that after Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009, one of the assaults by Israel on Palestine, on Gaza, where Israel unleashed horrific violence against Gaza, campus protests had to be contained. But the RGS response to PALFest, to cancel the event, had an additional sting in its tail. And this long and intentionally polemical introduction is to bring us to this point. The public statement issued by RGS to absolve itself of its cowardice stated, and I quote, "Our decision is based on prioritizing the safety of those in and around our building, and is consistent with security advice and the views of those responsible for other historically significant buildings and venues." The irony of denying space to a people dispossessed of space and place by Israeli settler colonialism was not lost on many hundreds of geographers who wrote to protest this decision. Where is Palestine? Where can Palestine be? This erasure of Palestine happens again and again. Where is Palestine when the mainstream press and broadcast media speak of the quote-unquote Israel-Hamas war, as if the vast majority of those killed have not been civilians, and almost all the destruction has not been wreaked upon life-sustaining civilian structures, including universities? The people surviving and dying in Gaza are called in these newsletters, and even by well-meaning people, Gazans, when they're actually Palestinians in Gaza. This matters politically because the word Palestine should not be erased, but also technically or factually because the majority of the people that are in Gaza were ethnically cleansed from other places in Palestine in 1948. So they're not from Gaza itself. There are other forms of erasure. The passive exonerative tense used in the press to discuss the regular slaughter of Palestinians by the Israeli military and its non-uniform wearing settler militias. The memory holding of a century of settler colonialism. In fact, calls to retire decolonization, settler colonialism, and genocide as relevant or illuminating concepts. These all have come up in the last 11 months. The deliberate disregard of the vast archive of Israeli soldiers committing atrocities, including existing videos of Palestinian detainees being raped. The anemic response to the killing of nearly 200 journalists. The destruction of every single university in Gaza. And on and on and on. Where is Palestine? Palestine is made to disappear. It is unmoored, ignored, and silenced again and again and again in all these ways. Okay, deep breath now. In what follows, I will first consider the place of Palestine in the imaginaries of the colonizers and those who support them. I will then follow this discussion with a love letter to the liberatory imaginaries of Palestine as a place of struggle, persistence, resistance, and flourishing. What I hope to do in particular in the second part of the lecture is to essentially fade into the background and allow for Palestinian voices and music and artwork to come to the foreground. Palestinian spaces have acted as signifier and symbols of Old and New Testament sites of projection of piety, of destinations for ethno-nationalist longings. Palestine has been portrayed as an empty space, primed to receive settlers, a place without a people for a people without a place, state without a people, country without a people, land without a people. I mean, all the different words are used. A desert made to bloom, a malarial swamp drained and made productive. Israeli officials have at various times fantasized about Palestinians being pushed into the sea or the desert or being expelled to a reclaimed offshore space, a Singapore on the Med, or even to the moon. In 1965, Palestinian intellectual, diplomat, activist, and academic Fayez Sayegh founded the PLO Research Center in Beirut, whose very first publication in the same year was to be his own Zionist colonialism in Palestine. He wrote this in 1965, so before the 1967 occupation of West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, Sinai, and Golan. Sayegh's acute analysis, which feels only more pertinent as time has passed, characterizes settler colonialism as being constituted around racialism and racialization, violence and terror, and territorial expansion. Sayegh, in 1965, describes the shape Israel under the supposedly progressive and socialist Labour Party would take. And this, with the exception of the East Bank of Jordan and southern Lebanon up to the Litani, is in fact the map of Israel after 1967, which also included Sinai. So there had been a lot of talk of also going to the East Bank of Jordan, not just the West Bank. And so what you see is in that map, which appears in Sayegh's book. This is the actual map after 1967. But in fact, there are also maximalist maps, which Sayegh mentions. And this is the map of Eretz Israel, which encompasses the land from the Nile to the Euphrates. So you can see it. It goes all the way to the Nile in the west, and it goes to the border of Iran in the east. And in fact, this particular badge is worn by Israeli soldiers. This was posted on 22nd of August, 2024. Already in 1965, Sayegh was describing the fate of Palestinians as subsuming, and I quote, foreign domination, exploitation, and dispossession, and others beside. The territory of Palestine is under alien rule. Its resources are exploited by others. Its people are exiled from their homeland. The remnants of its Arab inhabitants languish under a regime of racist discrimination and oppression as harsh as any race supremacist regime in Asia and Africa. The military control over Palestinians remaining inside Israel was not removed until 1966, the year after Sayak wrote this. All this has been accomplished with by connivance with imperialism and by terror and violence. In the context of Israeli settler colonialism, a violent imposition of fragmentation has been a remarkably powerful tool of control. Walls, checkpoints, and permit regimes rule. Omar Jabari Salamanca has written, for example, about the apartheid road 443 in this context. The roads serve multiple functions. A road, on the one hand, separates and divides Palestinian lands and habitations into ever smaller enclaves. On the other hand, it allows for demolition and dispossession. And on the third hand, if one is allowed a third, they're like all transport infrastructures, fungible for military use. The Netzarim corridor, running east-west halfway through Gaza Strip, and essentially put there in the last few months, is 2 kilometers wide. Buffer zones around these roads are a means of expropriation as well as control. And you can see the names of the villages that have been destroyed in order to bulldoze this corridor. The Green Line serves the same function. As Omar Jabari Salamanca, Mezna Qatto, Karim Rabi, and Subhi Samour have written in their immensely important essay on settler colonialism, which came out about 10 years ago, the Green Line, the border between Israel and the Palestinian reserves, is one example of this phenomenon of fragmentation. It has become a powerful symbolic and material signifier that enforces and takes for granted the fragmentation of the Palestinian polity. With few exceptions, it is a line that is rarely crossed in scholarly accounts of Palestine in either direction. Different Palestinian populations have come to be represented as isolated, analytically separate pieces of an impossible puzzle. Much the same way that Palestinian people, every one of them, is registered and recorded, surveilled, and has had their biometric data stored centrally by Israel, every Palestinian house, every space, every neighborhood is gridded, ready to be targeted, surveilled with drones, bombed, demolished, or subjected to the kind of ethnic cleansing now passing as humanitarian evacuation in Gaza. This is a flyer that is dropped by Israel on Gaza, and it shows the different grids, and ostensibly it's a humanitarian evacuation, but people are pushed into ever smaller and smaller and smaller areas. Homes are demolished in swathes in Gaza and in smaller numbers as punitive measures elsewhere. As Palestinian physician, politician, and activist Mustafa Barghouthi has said, sometimes they kill us wholesale, sometimes they kill us retail. Home demolitions breach the public-private constantly. These home demolitions extend across the area controlled by Israel. In the Negev desert, inside the borders of Israel, as a sovereign state, Bedouin settlements inhabited by Palestinian citizens of Israel, marked as Bedouin, are constantly demolished. In East Jerusalem, Palestinian houses are physically occupied by settlers who just move in. And in some neighborhoods, Palestinian homes are destroyed because they have not received requisite permits. In Gaza, the periodic destruction of residences, with its current genocidal crescendo, is a strategy of making Gaza uninhabitable, and it has been since the 1950s. Inside the Green Line, Palestinian citizens also have to be spatially contained. Wherever Palestinians are concentrated, space is reshaped to give Jewish Israelis optical and spatial control by establishing settlements overlooking Palestinian towns and villages. The most famous of these overlooks is what was formerly called Nazareth Illit, or Upper Nazareth. David Ben-Gurion himself was very concerned about Jewish control and supremacy in Galilee. He wrote in a letter to the Jewish Agency in 1962, he demanded to speed up the growth of Nazareth Illit, of Upper Nazareth. He explicitly ordered them to form a separate local council than its neighbor. And I quote from the David Ben-Gurion letter, certainly not a mixed Jewish-Arab settlement. When Palestinian citizens tried to move into Upper Nazareth, they set off alarms about demographic changes. In the early 2000s, an increase in Palestinian population in Nazareth Illit from 9 to 13% was alarming enough that the Jewish mayor put into action new plans for bringing in more settlers from places like Gush Katif in Hebron across the Green Line, culminating in the name of the place being changed in 2019 to Nuf HaGalil, so it would not be mixed up with Nazareth. Now, that was the actuality of it. But there is also an element of imagination that is at work here. To examine Zionist imaginaries of Palestine, I begin with the pre-Yishuv era, with Palestine as a terra nullius of decay, a wasteland. This appears in particular in Theodor Herzl's novel, Alt Neuland, the Old New Land, a kind of a boy's own colonial adventure, complete with a South Pacific island retreat as an element of it. The utopian imperial fantasy was written in 1902, shortly before Herzl died, and imagined Palestine as a kind of an Orientalist nightmare in 1903 and again in 1923 after it was fully colonized by Zionists, so it had a before and after kind of image. Herzl described the pre-Yishuv Palestine thus. Jaffa made a very unpleasant impression upon them. Though nobly situated on the blue Mediterranean, the town was in a state of extreme decay. Landing was difficult in the forsaken harbor. The alleys were dirty, neglected, full of vile odors. Everywhere misery in bright oriental rags. Poor Turks, dirty Arabs, timid Jews lounged about indolent, beggarly, hopeless. A peculiar tomb-like odor of mold caught one's breath. The landscape through which they passed was a picture of desolation. The lowlands were mostly sand and swamp. The lean fields looked as if burnt over. The inhabitants of the blackish Arab villages looked like brigands. Naked children played in the dirty alleys. Over the distant horizon loomed the deforested hills of Judea. The bare slopes and the bleak, rocky valleys showed few traces of present or former cultivation. One wonders why they wanted it. In Alt Neuland circa 2023, so in this thing that he's imagining into the future, Zionist settlement has transformed the land into neatly divided subplots with houses with electricity and phone lines, private property, and green lawns more appropriate to rainy northern Europe and forests of pines and evergreens. Herzl himself saw Israel as a European outpost against Asiatic barbarism. Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the grandfather of what we could call the Likud, the godfather, the sort of the thinker that's put together its ideas, and the boss of Benjamin Netanyahu's father, saw Israel succeeding through, and I quote, an iron wall of Jewish bayonets. In 2006, Prime Minister Ehud Barak described Israel as a villa in the jungle. Naftali Bennett, briefly Prime Minister of Israel, sees it as the startup nation, a Silicon Valley in Sparta. This is to complement the various fantasies of bombing various Palestinian places and also neighbors to Stone Age, so not just a place, but also a time. Rather amazingly, also Rhodesia with nukes. It's not meant to be a pejorative, it's supposed to be celebratory. And what to do with Palestinians if you've got all of these things? In the first phase of colonization preceding the Nakba of 1948 and going on for a few years thereafter, Palestinians were made refugees in the region. In September 1948, Ben-Gurion wrote in his diary, and I quote, "We have to pester the refugees relentlessly. We need to pester and motivate the refugees in the south to move eastward as well, since they won't go towards the sea, and Egypt won't let them in." This job was assigned to the transfer committee of the Mossad, and they were supposed to actually then look for places to send people. Later, Hadi al-Asali has written about the 1969 plan to expel 60,000 Palestinians to Stroessner's Paraguay for $33 a head. In the last 57 years, the perennial plan to resettle the Palestinians of Gaza elsewhere have often alit on Sinai. Most recently, this zombie plan was revived by the genocidal general Giora Eland. Back in 1967, and this one, I want you guys to remember this one, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol employed an Italian-Israeli former Mossad agent involved in settlement activities, Ada Sereni, who also actually was portrayed in that famous Hollywood film, propaganda film, Exodus. Levi Eshkol employed Ada Sereni to negotiate with Italy the possibility of sending Palestinians from Gaza to Libya, itself Italy's former colony. Eshkol is reported to have told her, I want them all to go, even if they have to go to the moon. Now remember this particular going to the moon for later in the lecture. And now there's the idea of Singapore on the Med. In 2017, plans were devised for an offshore island connected to Palestine proper, to Gaza proper, with a 3-mile-long bridge where the harbor and airport can be under full Israeli control. Transportation and Intelligence Minister Yisrael Katz said at the time, in an absurd way, we're giving Hamas the keys to the world's largest prison. It's funny that he actually recognized that. The post-genocide plan for reconstruction in Gaza borrowed from the Katz plan. For those of you guys from the US, there's Bill Ackman, who managed to dethrone the president of Harvard. Bill Ackman wants Palestinians in Rafah moved into refugee camps in the Negev desert while Gaza is reconstructed in the image of the Saudi Neom. Netanyahu also has Neom in mind and wants to turn Gaza into a free trade zone with train connections across Negev and through Eilat and Aqaba to Neom. Of course, the unspoken element of these Neom Singapore plans is the authoritarian system of migrant labor exploitation and control that defines both Singapore and Saudi Arabia. More serious discussions at the Wilson Center at the US, they held a meeting on the 7th of May to launch plan for post-war Gaza. And as you can see, the discussants are all white military and security men, including General Keith Dayton, who was in charge of finding weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, so obviously super competent. But the reality is grim. Only a few days ago, Bloomberg reporters, notably most of them of Arab or Palestinian origin, asked a simple question. How will Gaza be rebuilt when there are 42 million tons of rubble to remove? The removal of which alone will cost nearly $1 billion. I'll let you guys linger on that for a minute. Okay, another deep breath. Forgive me for this long-winded Jeremiah, with things you probably know, and with catastrophic, claustrophobic, deeply disturbing and devastating recounting of histories and geographies of settler colonialism. As Omar Jabari Salamanca, Poonam Khosla, and Natasha Aruri wrote 164 days into the Israeli onslaught against Palestinians in Gaza, how does one write, speak, in the midst of an ongoing genocide? In this last part of the lecture, I want to focus not on death and control of spaces, but on life as Palestinians grasp, wrestle with it, and create it in the interstices of ongoing murder. Palestinians have imagined and enacted Palestine in myriad ways to reclaim it as theirs and as a site of living and flourishing. I will focus in particular on 5 different Palestinian spaces: the hills of Galilee, Ramallah and Nablus, the sea at Gaza, Akka and Jaffa, Jerusalem or Al-Quds, the desert at Naqab or Negev, and the refugee camps in the Shatat or the diaspora. I'll begin with one of the greatest lovers of Palestinian landscape, Raja Shahade. Raja Shahade has written a number of books, and I highly recommend, if you don't know his works, they're wonderful. They're about walking the hills and walking as a method, essentially. As Raja Shahada, whose books on walking in the quote-unquote vanishing landscapes in the West Bank hills and ravines are at once idylls and elegies, writes, Palestine has been one of the countries most visited by pilgrims and travelers over the ages. The accounts I have read do not describe a land familiar to me, but rather a land of these travelers' imaginations. Palestine has been constantly reinvented with devastating consequences to its original inhabitants. Whether it was the cartographers preparing maps or travelers describing the landscape in the extensive travel literature, what mattered was not the land and its inhabitants as they actually were, but the confirmations of the viewers' or readers' religious or political beliefs. He adds, with a lament familiar to anyone who knows how Christian Zionists in the US, for example, imagine Gog Magog, quote unquote, perhaps the curse of Palestine is its centrality to the West's historical and biblical imagination. Shahadi's writings, in particular in his Palestinian walks, about 7 different walks on these hills, is deeply attuned to the plays of light and time and space. At the same time, the changing landscape allows him, who's a lawyer at Al-Haq, one of the oldest Palestinian human rights groups, to trace transformations of this landscape through struggles over what is property and whose title deed matters. He records the laceration of landscape by settlements on these hills. There are places that no longer have wildflowers because their streams have been rerouted to water the settlements, and places that have effectively become nature reserves and free fire zones because Palestinians are not allowed to farm them in the West Bank. He writes about the sharp scent of za'atar, thyme, foraging for which was forbidden by Israel under the pretext of environmental protection. A reissue of the book, a more recent reissue of the book, also records Raja Shahada's unsettling encounter with a young settler who believes these lands, these hills, are his divine inheritance. In a way, Mona Hatim, another great Palestinian artist, her mysterious works, produced during the Intifada and after, also track the encounters with Israeli state violence and with carcerality. That one is from 1988, just as the Intifada was going on. This one, which if you haven't seen, is extraordinary. It looks like a prison, but then once you get close to it, those lights are actually super hot. So they're also instruments of torture. And finally, Light Sentence, which she produced after spending some time at a penitentiary in Philadelphia, so the kind of a convergence between the carceralities of the United States and of Palestine. I have followed Shahada and Hatum's work for decades. But younger Palestinians in the lands occupied in 1967 have their own ways of mapping and celebrating this landscape, which has been already catastrophically transformed since this joyful video that I'm going to show you guys was filmed in 2020. The video that I'm going to show you marries very specific Palestinian spatial sensibilities with Palestinian dabke adapted to a world trend, the Jerusalem dance. Before I begin, let me just enumerate the sites where this is filmed in case you missed them. The creators of the video describe the sites as such: Jerusalem, Khan's Roof, the iconic Dome of the Rock in the background. Gaza, 78 kilometers from Jerusalem, at the Gaza seaport that remains blocked off from the world and probably destroyed now. Bethlehem, 10 kilometers from Jerusalem, at the Church of the Nativity, birthplace of Jesus Christ. Ramallah, 15 kilometers from Jerusalem, Qalandiya checkpoint between Ramallah and Jerusalem, near the major apartheid wall that cuts off the West Bank from Jerusalem. Jenin, 75 kilometers from Jerusalem, invaded last night. Atop a mountain with the Marja ibn Amr Valley and the 1948 occupied Palestinian lands in the background. Lovely AV people, can you please turn on the video for a moment of joy? It's going to take a second to come on.
Jerusalema, ikhaya lami, ilondoloze, uhambe nami, zungangishilana. Jerusalema, ikhaya lami, ilondoloze, uhambe nami, zungangishilana. Dawo yami ayikholana, buso wami awukholana. Ilondoloze, zuhambe nami. Dawo yami ayikholana, buso wami awukholana. Ilondoloze, dawo yami ayikholana, buso wami awukholana. Ilondoloze, zuhambe nami. Dawo yami ayikholana, buso wami awukholana. Ilondoloze, zuhambe nami. Jerusalema, ikhaya lami, ilondoloze, 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 zungangishila. Ilondoloze, ilondoloze,
Thank you. I do wonder how many of the young men from Gaza portrayed in here are no longer alive. Jerusalem is also at the heart of the so much longing and writing. Mourid Barghouti, a fabulous Palestinian poet, in his prose poem Meditation on Returning to Ramallah, translated into English by Ahtaf Swaif, writes, "All that the world knows of Jerusalem is the power of the symbol. The dome of the rock is what the eye sees, and so it sees Jerusalem and is satisfied. The Jerusalem of religions, the Jerusalem of politics, the Jerusalem of conflict is the Jerusalem of the world. But the world does not care for our Jerusalem, the Jerusalem of the people, the Jerusalem of houses and cobbled streets and spice markets, the Jerusalem of the Arab college, the Rashidiyya school and the Umariyya school, the oil markets and the sellers of antiques and mother of pearl and sesame cakes, the library, the doctor, the lawyer, the engineer, and the dresser of the brides with high dowries, the Jerusalem of white cheese, of oil and olive and thyme, or baskets of figs and necklaces and leather in Salah ad-Din Street." This incantation of names, the repetition again and again of places and objects and things, feels talismanic. It is an act of love and of salvage and of writing maps of places that are down on no maps, like all truth places are. One of my favorite quotes from Moby Dick. The late Dia Batal's homage to homeland also names landscapes in her extraordinarily beautiful calligraphy, mapping the places she cannot visit. She touches on this sense of fragmentation in her other works, including Fragments of Being, drawing together spatial and embodied disintegration. And so this kind of work, which names places in this particular calligraphy that Dia, who was taken from us by cancer only just last year, she invented this calligraphy, and it's a beautiful way of kind of mapping places in an abstract way. Emily Jasser's memorial to 418 Palestinian villages, which were destroyed, depopulated, and occupied by Israel in 1948, similarly records the names of places painstakingly embroidered by people she knew. She describes these people so, quote, "Most were Palestinians, some of whom came from the villages in question. Some were Israelis who grew up in the remains of these villages, and they were joined by people from a multitude of backgrounds." I want to note that Emily Jasser's work is some of the most confrontationally radical artwork being produced about Palestine by a Palestinian. But although she's collected by MoMA and Guggenheim and Tate, they have chosen to go for her most cryptic and mysterious pieces, which focus on the intimate and individual works, rather than the more expensive, explicitly political, more collective works. Where is Palestine in MoMA's collection of Palestinian artists? Inside the Green Line, Michel Khleifi's Wedding in Galilee, produced in 1987, was one of the first feature films by a Palestinian inside Israel that made an international splash. If you haven't seen the film, you must, but there are a few stills from the film that you can see. And the words of Ella Shohat. The camera's painstaking and affectionate scrutiny of rural collective ceremonies and rituals, of the people's primal love of the land and its fruits, does not remain on the level of an anthropological fascination with a Middle Eastern society, but rather makes a simple political point. We are here and we exist. And while the Zionist perspective sees vegetation and fruitfulness as the product of the European Jewish pioneers who made the desert bloom, the Wedding in Galilee, associates earth, crops, trees, vegetation, and abundance of food with the Palestinians. Even the name is meant to invoke abundance, and the biblical wedding at Cana, where Jesus turns water into wine. The Galilee is ever present in the stories and poetries of Palestinians. It's also where Mahmoud Darwish comes from. But here's Tawfiq Zayyad, who you may not know as much as you would do Mahmoud Darwish, and his poem, The Impossible. Like 20 impossibilities in Al-Lud, in Ramle, in the Galilee, all inside the Green Line. We shall remain, a weight upon your heart, like a wall upon your chest. We are like pieces of glass, like a prickly pear. We shall remain, guard the shade of the fig and olive tree, ferment rebellion in the hearts of our children as yeast in the dough. Zayyad's poem inspired Anne-Marie Jasser's first short film, Like 20 Impossibles, which brings together diasporan Palestinians as well as Palestinian citizens of Israel and those in the West Bank. It's a fictional short about how these Palestinians come together to make a film. And they're trying to go to Jerusalem, but they can't cross the checkpoint. They're detained, and the diasporan Palestinian with the US passport is sent off, while the Palestinians in the West Bank are kept. So can I please ask you to play the trailer for it?
אז תנו לי תעודות. אהויה. ديناوية ديناوية לא לצלם, אמרתי לך.
I have a press card.
לא לצלם, אתה לא
Actually, we
מבין?
have
לא
a permit
לצלם.
to shoot.
לא לצלם.
The film ends with 2 lines from Tawfiq Zayed's poem. Like 20 impossibles, we shall remain. This insistence on remaining even pertains to Palestinian citizens of Israel. In Israel, there's a legal category called present absentees. Present absentees are people designated as absentees, and therefore their properties have been expropriated by the State of Israel and Palestinians who've been designated as absentees, but who actually are not refugees. And therefore they're present, but they're absentees for the purpose of their property having been expropriated by the State of Israel. There are many present absentees, Palestinian citizens of Israel who were ejected from their villages, who after years of struggle secured a citizenship in Israel, but also having been dispossessed and exiled from their villages, insist on their right to their original homes. They do so through the courts, but even more importantly and significantly, through annual rights of return to their destroyed villages. In this instance, Kafar Bar'am and Iqrit in Galilee, not too far from the border from Lebanon. Their annual picnics there bring together those who still remain and remember their villages as places they inhabited, but also of generations thereafter who insist on remembering. They collect the fruit of the sabra, the cacti, that stubbornly marks the boundaries of destroyed, albeit not forgotten villages. And interestingly, when these villages were destroyed and all of their greeneries, farms, orchards were uprooted, the sabra remained. So one of the ways in which Palestinians, when they return to their destroyed villages, find the entrance to it is through where these cacti grow. They collect the fruit of the sabra, the cacti that stubbornly mark the boundaries of destroyed, albeit not forgotten villages. They sing, they tell stories, they draw together every year to make places and to insist we shall remain. Inside, there's also Naqab, or the Negev, which has played such a huge role in the Zionist imaginary with its Masada and Dimona nuclear weapons, research center, and the decades-long fantasies of building a canal to rival Suez. Adania Shebli's novel, minor detail, takes place primarily on the way to the Naqab, whose low undulating hills she describes as swelling in every direction, their deep blue shapes incredibly still. As a contemporary character travels across the border, first using the aforementioned Road 443, using a Palestinian citizen of Israel's ID and car in order to be able to cross the border without problems, that allows her to arrive in Naqab. She also says something, the book is quite funny in some ways. She's got a little bit in there where she is at first worried about whether or not that having somebody else's ID on her would put her in danger, and then she's like, no, we all look the same to them, which is... Anyway, so she arrives, and on her way to Naqab, to the Negev, she also maps presences and absences. I go back and open the map, which depicts Palestine until 1948, and let my eyes wander over it, moving between the names of the many Palestinian villages that were destroyed after the expulsion of their inhabitants that year. I recognize several of them. Some of my colleagues and acquaintances originate from there, from the villages of Lifta, Al-Qastal, Ain Karam, Al-Malha, Al-Jura, Abu Shusha, Siris, Innaba, Jimzu, Deir Tarif. But the majority of the names are unfamiliar to me, to the extent that they invoke a feeling of estrangement. Khirbat al-Amur, Birma'in, Al-Burj, Khirbat al-Buwaira, Beit al-Shanna, Salbit, Al-Qubab, Al-Kanisa, Kharruba, Khirbat Zakaria, Bariya, Deir Abu Salama, Al-Na'ani, Jindas, Haddatha, Abu al-Fadl, Kisla, and many others. I look at the Israeli map again, a very large park called Canada Park, now extends over the area where all these villages used to be. Shibley's book was banned at the Frankfurt Book Fair because of its historically accurate and well-recorded depiction of a rape of a Bedouin woman by Israeli soldiers in August 1949 as Israel consolidated its hold over the desert. The Negev is still a site of struggle. Today, between the state that wants to extend Jewish settlements into the area and displace the Bedouin of quote-unquote unrecognized villages throughout the area. These places, again, do not appear on any maps because true places never are, as Herman Melville wrote. In 2012, Shari Plonsky, who's sitting in the front row, interviewed Dr. Awad Abu Frey, a key activist and resident of Al-Aragib, who told her, do you know what is the meaning of an unrecognized village? You don't recognize the people. You don't recognize the village. These are actually citizens of Israel, so this is not even people in the West Bank or Gaza. You're saying to citizens of the state, I don't recognize you. But the Palestine of people's imagination are not only those of artists. There are other ways that Palestinians connect to their landscape, to their places and spaces. Here is Akka, inside. Here is Gaza in 2017. Here are photos taken by Tanya Habjuga in Gaza in 2014. Here are pictures from Jaffa at Eid al-Adha in 2022. When I first wrote the abstract for this talk, I sent it to Mizna Qatto to get her feedback on it. And she admonished me for not including the shatet, the diaspora, for so much of Palestinian imagining about Palestine and return takes place in the near and far diasporas, in refugee camps and in cities elsewhere. I shall have, in this penultimate section, only one remembrance. I first arrived in the Burj al-Barajni refugee camp in the southern neighborhood of Beirut in 2000 to do field work for a doctoral thesis that eventually became my first book, Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine. Burj al-Barajni camp, once a cluster of tents on sandy waste ground, is now a cement block, densely packed neighborhood, ensconced within the larger eponymous neighborhood. The camp grows vertically because its bounds are delimited strictly by the Lebanese government. Nasser Abu Rahmeh writes about these camps, cement becomes concrete and collides with the nationalist slogans and humanitarian rule. Cadastral mapping consolidates sectarian apprehension. Electrical wiring and PVC tubing circulate new social possibilities and dilemmas as they combine with embodied subjects skilled in their construction and ready to illegally plug into the network. In these combinations, contingent, often temporary, but highly effective, that act, express, transform something. As new generations are born and get married, new precarious stories are added to these towers of self-built concrete, as Abu Rahmeh describes them, reaching for little patches of sun. In these grey environs, walls are decorated with images of martyrs and the Dome of the Rock. But what is notable is the small Edens that grow on these rooftops, little pots of plants, sometimes of maramiye or sage, tea of which is made and given for upset stomachs, or za'atar grown, I actually don't know how you grow za'atar in a pot, but people do, or little tomato plants whose fruits are precious, but not even enough for one meal. And then there are songbirds and places to sit and smoke cigarettes. In fact, songbirds are a thing everywhere in Palestine, even in the ruins of infrastructures destroyed by Israel. This is the slide of the Gaza airport, which was bombed by Israel in 2002. In his paean to armed struggle, Musa'ad, Ghassan Kanafani writes about the differences and similarities between a mukhayyam, which is a refugee camp, and a mu'askar, which is a military camp. He says, in a tent, yes, but a tent in a refugee camp is quite different from one in a guerrilla base. But even the one in the refugee camps preserves something of the past, brings it into the present, connects it stubbornly to home, to the place where Palestinians shall return. And now to the conclusion. Palestine is not only a site of memory, desire, and dreams, but also a collection of places where, through swimming, walking, storytelling, picnicking, protesting, farming, working, and resisting, Palestinians again and again reproduce their Palestine. But there's also a problem at hand, which Edward Said articulated in his The Question of Palestine nearly 50 years ago. With no territory underneath one's feet, it is patently hard to know with certainty what, in any abstract sense, is the best course to steer. So I want to end with an answer given not only to Said, but also to Levi Eshkol, talking about sending Palestinians to the moon, with Palestinian artist Larissa Sansour's short film, A Palestinian Space Exodus, which can be seen as an artistic response to Levi Eshkol wanting to send Palestinians to the moon, but also to a century of Zionist ideology. The film is sly and funny and heartbreaking down to its name, Exodus, of course, which is the big, as I said, Hollywood propaganda film. But it is also about what it means to imagine Palestine as a place or a time or a futurity. As a Palestinian should have the last word here, I will stop, and hopefully the lovely AV people turn on the film. Thank you very much for your patience.
Jerusalem, we have a problem. No, everything is fine. We are back on track. The Sunbird has landed. That's one small step for a Palestinian, one giant leap for mankind. Jerusalem. Jerusalem.
Thank you, Professor Khalili. I think we'll try something we tried at the last lecture, given that it is really, really difficult to write amidst genocide, to think amidst genocide, which is to give you all just maybe 3 minutes to chat with your neighbor about what you thought about the lecture, what it made you think of, peer review your questions, and then we'll turn over the mic to you. So take 3 minutes to chat with your neighbor, please.
Can I quickly thank the AV folks? Because you guys are amazing. I don't know where you are. But your cueing was incredible. The sound was incredible. Everything was amazing. Thank you so much.
Okay. While you're chatting, Andy's going to run around with a mic. So if anyone wants to get us started, just raise your hand and he'll pass you the mic. Okay, who wants to get us started with some questions? Andy's got a mic on this side. Keen's got a mic on that side. Please just raise your hand and we will come to you so that our online audience can also hear your question. We need to hear all of them in the mic, please. Who would like to get us started?
They don't have to be peer-reviewed either.
Yeah, I've got a question here.
I really just wanted to thank you so much for an amazing talk and for doing something exciting with the idea of mapping. I kind of thought, oh no, not mapping again, but you managed to do something absolutely amazing with mapping, and something that was at once kind of horrific and hopeful at the same time. And this isn't really it's just bouncing off, particularly the final image. I tried this out on my neighbor and he didn't like it, but I'm going to say it anyway. I was just struck by that amazing image, going off into space in the film. And what that reminded me of is that I think some of the technology they've been using to map the impacts of bombardment, the size of the huge craters, as well as the fact that it's actually what's happened in Gaza is visible from space. I think they've actually been using the same technology they use to measure meteor impacts on other planets and moons. And the fact that that's the technology that you need to kind of make sense of the sheer horror and scale of the bombing of Gaza. And it's not a question, it just suddenly kind of reminded me of that. It was a moment both of kind of, sort of pleasure in that image, but horror simultaneously.
Thank you. I think part of the reason that I chose Larissa Sansures is because every time I watch that film, and I've watched it dozens of times, I see something new which speaks to the particular moment. But I think that what I love about it is that it is at once extremely funny. I mean, I don't know if you guys noticed the turned up shoes and the fact that it's called a sunbird, which is a Palestinian bird, and the funny ululation mixed in with the music from how. So she's got a major sense of humor, and it comes out. But then the sort of sinking into the darkness of space is also, as you say, completely horrific. And I think what it has invoked for you is that it holds both of those things at once. Part of the reason I really wanted to show that is because that film is because it does do that thing where it shows the horror, but it is also funny and future-facing, and also plays on space, right? So you guys are geographers. I thought you might like that.
Other questions? Don't be shy.
I didn't try this out on my neighbor, but I think he would disagree as well. I had a political question. So I think in the wake of such horror, it's essential to have art and artistic imagination to have a sense of persistence and maybe rebuild in the aftermath. But that's the old question of Fanon as well, the conflict between the artistic imagination and the political one. And it still leaves the question where in the campus protests, in the way that we express solidarity with Palestine, where do our sympathies go? There are some people who, of course we get depicted as pro-Hamas when we do all of this, and we are not always explicit enough in exactly how we relate to Hamas. Fatah, of course, has been sclerotic in many ways and has not, on the whole, been able to capitalize on all of this. So it's an old question, and sorry for raising this, but what can we hope for politically, and what when we say Intifada until the end, like where how does, this is also a theoretical question, how does the artistic imagination then precipitate or incubate maybe a kind of a politics which would be one of Palestinian liberation? So I know it's a big question, but you and your friends and you know, closer to the scene, where's the thinking going more or less? Thank you.
You guys had a really fruitful peer review session. Okay, let's start with the question of solidarity and how do we situate ourselves vis-a-vis Palestinians. I think the decision I'm not Palestinian, so the decision to how to situate oneself vis-a-vis the specific parties is that of the Palestinians. I support Palestinian liberation and I support Palestinian resistance, and I will stand behind my colleagues and students and Palestinians who are struggling in a variety of venues. So it's as simple as that. And I mean it's easier for me also to do that because I'm on a campus that is not as brutal as some of the others have been, certainly not like a, you know, UCLA or a Columbia or whatever. And I have students who are very active, and I have colleagues that are supportive. And I'm senior enough in my career, old enough age-wise, to have seen these kinds of periodic assaults on academic freedom and freedom of speech. So I know that you just have to stand your ground, and it passes. Having said that, I do think that for those of us who are not in precarious positions sitting here, it is imperative that we support our more early career or more precarious colleagues, because I think that particularly for those who choose to speak up about Palestinian resistance, it is a very difficult thing to do. And can I hear, Shari was already cited in my PowerPoints, but I am going to also say thank you to her because she's been part of the Academic Freedom Committee and various other kinds of committees of one of the whatever trade bodies we academics have, and she has been tireless. She and her colleagues have been tireless in trying to protect some of our academic colleagues. So can I please hear a hand for all of those among you who are doing that work? That's on the question of the campus. So that's campus work. And before I forget, if you're in Europe, the European Legal Support Center, if your administration or the police or anybody fucks around with you, remember ELSC. Their triage email, which is on their website, will get somebody to you, and they're amazing. And if you're in the US, there's also Palestine Legal, which does the same thing. I'm sure there are other bodies in other places. I think I heard a kind of an Antipodian accent there, so I don't know what they are there, but I know that there are bodies, so remember that in support of your more precarious colleagues or yourself. On the question of artistic, I mean, one of the things about Palestine that has been extraordinary and it has been amazing is the extent to which from before the Nakba and all the way since, there has been this unbelievable efflorescence of artistic production. Now, a lot of what was there before, say, the 1960s or 70s was poetry and literature and plastic arts that were still plastic arts. Lots of paintings, sculpture, etc. But what has been amazing is the extent to which there is film and music and conceptual art being produced by Palestinians. And I think that is incredibly important. Some years back, I think Edward Said was interviewed in the 1990s, and he said something to the effect that when people recognize Palestinian films and filmmakers with the same ease that they do an Exodus, for example, which was produced in Hollywood, is when we have actually reached people. And I think that part of what I wanted to do here was also to have some mixture of those things that we saw. We saw I'm not a very visual person. I love reading. I'm not an audiovisual person. But I thought it was really important to also show the films and all the filmmakers and artists that are doing incredible work. Because I think what they will do is they will not only insist that we are here and we shall remain, but that they also imagine futures in which possibilities are endless, precisely because Palestinians have so many different positionalities in so many different political and geographic contexts. And I think that that's also important to recognize. I just think that it's really important to acknowledge that even famously, Adorno said there will be no poetry after Auschwitz. But of course, I think he was wrong. I think he was just a grumpy old guy, brilliant but grumpy. But I do think that it is imperative on artists to keep producing. Although, of course, this is a moment of pause where everybody is catching their breath, and so I think, and they will, because I think that is what Palestinian artists are incredibly good at, because they have had to, because this is the language that remains them.
Question there, and then one in the back there. I think we'll start in the back, and then we'll take yours, if that's okay. We'll take two in a row.
Hi, I'm Ammar Azzouz. Thanks so much, Lale, for the really powerful and also emotional and heartfelt presentation. I wanted to ask you about your response to the feedback you got from Mizna on diaspora, especially that Palestine means so many things to many people who are connected to it from heritage, but maybe they were born and raised without being able to have seen it physically. And of course, many people who are forcibly displaced from their homes feel the same connection to be unable to return. And that right to return keeps the place different in the hearts and minds of people who are witnessing the trauma from so far away. So I wondered, what was your response? And of course, we have seen some of the responses you made, so thank you so much.
Yeah, 2 questions at a time. Thank you very much.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so we're squeezing the second one here.
Thank you very, very much for this very touching talk. Actually, I have a question about the reconstruction of Gaza and your thoughts about it, because you've shown some images of it. It's the Israeli imaginations of the reconstruction of post-war Gaza, which are of course horrific. But I was actually wondering how can we actually start thinking about the reconstruction, and how can we actually reconstruct Gaza without reconstructing the apartheid state? And how can we actually contribute to this reconstruction as non-Palestinians with our imaginations? I'm an architect, but without colonizing the project already. So, because you've shown some images, how can we bring counter images, counter mappings perhaps to that?
Thank you. Okay, on the question of the Shetet, I mean, Mizna, when she says, I obey. For those who don't know Mizna Ghatta, she's a Palestinian historian and one of the funniest and most brilliant human beings on earth. And she is like, I run everything by her because she will always find the little sort of breakages in things when they're not right. The reason, it is actually kind of odd that I hadn't thought to include the Shetet in there, because, of course, the vast majority of my research life has been spent in Lebanon and among Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And one of the things that you're talking about the right of return being crucial, is absolutely crucial. And the imagination of the right of return is constantly replayed in the ways in which Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, or in the region, but also elsewhere, construct a relationship with Palestine itself. When the south of Lebanon was liberated and people could actually go up to the border, it was amazing, and it still happens. Well, not right now, but Palestinians from the camps would go to one side of the border fence and look across until, of course, Israel built a buffer zone, like it always does with all of these spaces, foreclosing that possibility. But even beyond that, Palestinians who end up getting citizenships from elsewhere, they do try to go. When I visited, obviously because I'm not Palestinian, I could go visit. And when I went to, for example, Tarshiha, I made sure I made films for my friends that were from Tarshiha back. Or Farah is one of the tiny little villages on the border that one of my friends was from. So there are these very strange ways that people connect and remain connected. And I think that as somebody who's a major foodie and also a major glutton, food is an enormously important element of maintaining a connection. And so the people that cook in the household tend to be the ones that maintain the stories that comes with cooking. That was why it was important for me to mention the way Za'atar appears in the writings of Murid Barghouthi, and it appears in the writings of Raja Shahada, and it appears in the little pots that people grow on top of their buildings, because Za'atar is so central to the Palestinian way of imagining their connection to the space, or olive oil, or, you know, and so I think that food ends up being quite an important element of this. I want to tell a story, and I'm sorry, I'm going to probably run a little bit over time. Some years back, there was a story somewhere written about this Cuban woman. This has nothing to do with Palestine, but you'll know what I'm talking about. Who discovered that when her mother cooked, she did this very strange set of rituals when she cooked dough. She threw something behind the stove. And she had no idea what... Do you know what I'm talking about, Shari? And she had no idea what this was about. And this was like cooking for Easter. The family were Christians. She started researching it, and she discovered that this ritual, so her family in Cuba had been immigrants to Cuba, settlers from Spain into Cuba in the 16th century. She discovered that her family had been conversos, so Jews that had been forced to convert to Christianity and had emigrated. But the rituals of eating, which had been associated with Jewish culture, Sephardic Jewish culture, had been retained and passed down despite the family having converted to Christianity across however many centuries. Which to me was like, food is so important as a repository of memory, even if we don't remember. Because it ends up like being this set of rituals which we don't connect. And I know that that is incredibly significant in the ways in which Palestinians connect to the idea of return and to the idea of coming home. And they, you know, and the right of return, perhaps not in my lifetime, but it will be fulfilled. I mean, I think it's going to have to be. That's just it. And that kind of ties into the question of reconstruction. I hesitate to prescribe for reconstruction, in part because A, we're in the midst of a genocide, and B, from the experience of reconstruction Palestinians have undergone, for example, of Jenin camp after the 2002 Israeli invasion, destruction, or the Nahr al-Bared camp in Lebanon, which was destroyed by the Lebanese state, Lebanese security forces, in the 2010s, I think. Can't remember the exact date. The reconstruction in those places have actually Hausmannized those places. So where, for example, the alleyways and things protected people and the guerrillas from being, and protected them in some ways, you now have, you know, big boulevards, which the cavalry can ride through. In addition to that, of course, as we know, I don't have to tell you guys, every process of post-war reconstruction is a process through which property is essentially expropriated, or common property is expropriated and made private property, and it's often distributed upwards. We know that, for example, from the reconstruction of Beirut and the Solidaire, which has been a kind of a travesty in that area. And so, in some ways, I don't want to talk about this, because I think that whatever reconstruction plan happens, while Israel continues its settler colonial rule, is going to be a travesty. The fantasies of Neom or some sort of a Singapore on the Med, essentially is a fantasy of maintaining apartheid. You produce barracks that people are going to live in, and those people are going to go and work. Because, of course, one of the things that is really interesting is that since in these last 11 months, Israel has really suffered from a massive shortage of labor. It's importing workers from India. And so I think it's an apartheid system dependent on Palestinian labor. And so what I fear is that the reconstruction is essentially going to be a Bantustan's and until, as I said, the end of settler colonial regime of rule. In terms of what you can do from the outside, ask Palestinians what they want you to do. And there are, if you're an architect, there are loads of really amazing Palestinian architects and architectural associations who I'm sure would love to be having comrades in solidarity and support. So do ask them. I don't know what architects can do. I mean, you guys are kind of crazy and amazing, so I'm sure you can do something.
All right, I think we're out of time. And Andy's reminding me to invite everybody to the reception, which is in the parking? The parking lot? In the marquee.
So American. Oh my God.
My bad.
In the marquee, the tent in the back.
All right, the big tent in the back. Please join me in thanking Professor Khalili one more time.
Bye.